you kind of learn that people can tell if you've just like crammed the FT the day before. If you've come prepared and you've done the work, they won't expect you to know everything.
What are some things to help them prepare for that experience?
I'd say my top tip would be
Hi, and welcome to Cutting Edge. This is our first episode, and today we're really excited to have Ahmed on board. So Ahmed, thank you so much for joining us. It'd be great if you could give us a little bit of an intro, your background, what you've been up to, and we can just go from there.
Sure, thanks Tom, happy to be here. Just a little bit of background. So I'm just about to start my third year at uni. I'm studying at the University of York, doing economics and finance. I just finished my internship super recently. The year before that I did an internship as well. Excited to get third year started off.
Oh, I can imagine, yeah. Third year actually, although it's when exams pick up. I think because you get into the swing of things, you kind of realize what societies work best. And it's your last year of freedom before the corporate world and all things in finance too. And you mentioned your internship. So would you be able to give us a bit more background on what exactly that entailed, which area of finance that was? Would be really interested to hear more about that.
Yeah, so I was interning at a top asset manager in the product group. And essentially what that's responsible for is the strategic product management. So looking at what kind of products do we want to release? What do we need to change based on market conditions, competitor, sort of the strategic objectives of the firm, and then also the product development. So operationally, how can we actually construct these products? What do we need to consider? Sort of get all the teams together to try and deliver outcomes for the business, and almost pitch to sort of senior members about why we want to make these business decisions.
That sounds really exciting. And actually, for my own interest, could you give us an example of the kind of product that you'd pitch to these people?
Yeah, so I think one good example would be a social fund that we were looking at the time of the firm, and sort of questions that you might ask are, why would clients want this? What are the difficulties surrounding this? And sort of the S and ESG has sort of been a big talking point now that's been neglected a little bit. So I think a lot of businesses are looking into how can we capitalize off of that. But at the same time, there's a lot of difficulties around launching a social fund because social looks very different depending on what type of, where you sort of are marketing it. And so it's quite a difficult product to launch, but at the same time, there's a lot of money to be made. So sort of people going on behind the scenes thinking about how do we do this.
Understood. And is this a relatively new sector in finance, or has it been around for a while, but it's taking off more and more? So what's your take on that side of things?
So social's been a thing for a while. I think in terms of what it's looked like, though, it still hasn't really been established. When you look at climate, even that hasn't been defined yet, but we all kind of know net zero, Paris aligned. That means, a lot to a lot of people. I think when you talk about like social housing, for example, you're talking UK versus Germany. Those two things mean very different things. So I think what's changing now is there's more of a push to try and define what that means. And so that's kind of where the market opportunity is.
That's a really good point. And thinking about ESG, often I think it's a fair statement to say that the E is probably what people think about the most, the environmental, and that's probably easy to quantify in terms of emissions and whatnot. But like you say, the S is such a broad remit, it could fall under so many different ramifications that defining it is probably a big issue. And do you feel now that the S and also potentially the G are sort of being more and more part of the equation of the ESG? And if so, or if not, how do you feel that could be improved in future with things like your product group?
Yeah, so I think S is going to be a bigger thing in the future. And that's something I did look at in my internship. And there's a few tailwinds behind that, or headwinds, I can't remember which word it is. But essentially, we've got like an aging population, there's sort of increased social tension. You got like a tight labor market in the UK and other countries as well. All of these are kind of drivers for companies to focus more on that social aspect. And in terms of like the difficulties of actually implementing that, like I said before, it's quite hard to define what social means because it's quite regional. Whereas if you look at like a climate product, you can launch one climate product and sell it to people in, Germany or France, UK, without having to do much changes. But if you're looking at social, it's a bit harder to do that. And it's also harder to connect with people because the issues we tackle in the UK in regards to social are sort of different than other countries as well. So it's sort of about how do you make this mass marketable? Sort of how do you connect with your end client? it's a different approach to climate, but I think at the same time, there is quite a lot of demand for it. And so I think it's something that's definitely going to take off.
Sure, it sounds really exciting and obviously a huge learning curve, I can imagine, for yourself. And actually, that was a good question I had in terms of how you came across this opportunity, what made you lean towards this. Is this something that you happened across, or did you speak to someone? If you could give us a bit more insight as to how you came across this in the first place.
Yeah, so it was something I kind of happened across, to be honest, because I think when you hear about finance, all you really hear about is like investment banking, trading. When I first joined uni, that was sort of the opportunities I was looking at. But I was quite fortunate in my first year. I did have like quite a lot of experiences. So I did like some internships. I did some spring weeks. So I think by second year, I sort of had a good idea of like what the industry looked like and where my interests might be suited to. But when it came to applying for internships in second year, I kind of spread my baskets. I wanted to explore less conventional paths. So sort of at the end, I had like various offers, and it was time to decide like, did I want to take the banking offer, or did I want to take this sort of business management role in asset management? So that was something I definitely had to go through.
Oh, excellent. And did you speak to people already in the industry to kind of get an idea as to what to expect? Or was it going into this business management side of things based on your previous spring weeks and also internships a little bit blind as to you didn't really know what to expect? You had some rough idea, but you were keen for a little bit of a change to see what else is in the world of finance, and I guess take more of an open approach.
Yeah, so I think a bit of both. You kind of don't really know what it's going to be like before you walk through the door. But at the same time, I think it's quite important to like reach out and have like a rough idea. So because of the experiences I had, I did like talk to quite a few people in different business roles within asset management. It sounded super interesting to me. I'd done like internships and like insight days, and I'd reached out to people on LinkedIn. So I had like a rough idea of what to expect, but at the same time, it was pretty blind.
I see. And do you feel that having done this experience and completed it now, you would recommend not only this role to others, but actually to current grads or aspiring interns and analysts to keep their options open? And what would be the benefit of actually keeping, like you said, a wide basket available for potential internships?
Yeah, so in terms of why you'd want to keep an open mind, everyone's different, right? People have different skills, people have different interests. And so kind of immediately, just the fact that you can only name 2 roles should kind of already tell you that maybe you should look elsewhere. Your skills might not necessarily match up, but I think if you like dig beneath the surface a little bit, there are actually like a lot of exciting roles outside of sort of like traditional investment banking that are like super interesting, like really exciting. You get to work with really cool people in different projects. So I think it's like definitely really important, especially early on in your career, right? Like if you're like a first year student, do you really know you want to be like a trader or a banker? Like even now, I don't know exactly what I want to do, right? So I think if you're really dead set on something, as long as you can justify it to yourself, right? If you can like list 3 reasons, and genuinely, not just for like a cover letter, that like you're really passionate about it, then fair enough. But I think definitely keeping an open mind throughout university is a good idea.
Sure, I completely agree. And also the experience is the key takeaway as to whether you lean towards something or not. And based on your experience, probably not just at this product group, but on previous internships and places you've worked at, how much of the team, the culture, the location impact your decision as to whether you like working there or not?
Massive. So I think one of the biggest drivers for why I was really happy in the team that I worked with was the culture. Like the team, I couldn't imagine, like genuinely, I couldn't imagine a better set of people to work with. And I think you need to find that team that aligns with sort of your interests and like, how well do you get on with them? Because like at the end of the day, your job is like a big part in terms of the work you're doing is a big part of your job, right? But the people you're sat on a desk with, all day, especially if you're working in finance, some of the hours can be like super long, right? Small things like whether you can have a conversation with the person next to you, sort of whether you can banter, if someone you can enjoy working on a project with. I think just in the 8 weeks I've been there, it's been like a massive positive contribution to like why I really enjoyed the team. And if you can imagine you're going to be there for years, it's definitely something you need to take into consideration.
I agree. And also the idea that they'd actually encourage you to be yourself and to chat with other people, get to know others, because it's probably more fun for them having especially an intern on the desk, learning something new, getting to know you a bit. And actually, if you feel part of a team and you're contributing not just to a project or piece of work for a senior, but to the broader mission. I mean, in your case, a social fund, for example, that's an extremely interesting, rewarding piece of work. I guess that reflects on your experience and how you feel more generally about the company you're working for.
Yeah, but at the same time, it's hard to know, right? Before you like do an internship, you can sort of like go through the interviews and like you can look online. You don't really know what like the culture's like until you get your foot in the door, especially in these like massive, corporations and finance. Teams are probably quite different as well. So I think sort of just try and be as open to many different experiences as possible, talk to people in different teams, try to do as many different, work experience placements you can do. And sort of just when you find that team that you just like click with, it's like a good sign.
In a way, it's all the stars have to be aligned for you to find the perfect experience that you like, because you might have the perfect technical role, like let's say a product group or investment banking, and it could be fantastic. But if the team or the culture aren't exactly what you had in mind, or you find that you are working, say, more on one kind of sector as opposed to something you're more interested in, that could affect your ultimate decision. So that feeds back into what you're saying, that just by trial and error and trying all these various internships and experiences, you're much more likely that by the end of university to have a good feel for what you are, what you're not interested in.
Yeah, absolutely. I just caveat that a little bit because like I'm quite privileged to have like gotten a lot of these opportunities. Like I can appreciate, sort of most people's experiences that like they apply for like a ton of internships and they do one, it's like one team and like one work, one job. So like culture and like the team and like technical fit is super important. But I think another thing to consider is that, these corporations are massive. You can move around. You can learn skills that are like applicable to different companies and different roles. So sort of whatever experience you end up doing, like regardless of whether you think it's like a perfect fit, just making sure you make the most out of that and get the most out of that experience is super important.
Sure, and you touched on this idea of the application process in internships, and we both know that it's often dreaded and a very long, lengthy process with so many different stages. I think it can only be increasing from the time we started applying to probably what it is now, with the CV, cover letter submission, things like psychometric tests, video interviews, and then finally the assessment centers themselves. So that's such a long process. So before we delve into the specifics of each stage, and what would you advise prospective interns and analysts as to how to go about that, let's start with what's your broader advice for people generically when approaching the application process? What are some tips to get you through that whole process and make your life easier?
So I guess more broadly, it's a numbers game. Like these like internship and like analyst positions, they're like super competitive. You've got like hundreds of people applying to like one role a lot of the time. So I think make sure to get as many applications you can done sort of before you start applying. Have like a good think about why you're suited to the role. Like you should know that off the top of your head. If you're like applying for a role, you should be able to give like 3 reasons why you're suited and like why you desire to be in that role. And kind of just take it one step at a time. Like you said, it is kind of like daunting. I try not to think about like how many more steps are ahead. It's just like, I know I'm gonna have to get through this phase, so just try my best now. And if I get through, I do. If I don't, I don't. Move on. So I think just having like a resilient mindset and like going through as many applications as possible would be one thing. And then also surround yourself with people who are also doing it. So pretty much every like university will have like a finance society. I think if I didn't discover IFS, which is my university's finance society, don't think I'd be doing internships at all. It like helps a lot, especially when you're going through like rejection after rejection. Sort of have that person next to you going through the same thing and saying, just on to the next one. I think that helps in terms of like knowledge and then also just like team spirit.
The support network is invaluable, and ultimately surrounding yourself with people who are in the same boat as you, who you can relate to, and actually you're not the only person to go through hurdles, and to be able to learn from each other's experience, if anything, accelerates the whole process and gives you a higher chance of succeeding. And then I guess finding someone who can act as a buddy, and if you could sit down, practice tests with one another, practice interviews with one another, that must really help. And do you find that your finance society, for example, gave you that platform, those resources to help you succeed?
Yeah, absolutely. Because you're sort of like all in the same boat, right? You join university, a lot of you don't know anything about finance or like what internships are, sort of what's out there. So it's like really cool. You get to like see each other grow. Like the same people that I was like applying for spring weeks with are like the same people now that like were in London doing their internships with me. It's like quite rewarding as well. And then it's like really motivating. And then that learning experience, you know, is something as well, because there's only so many firms, like you're applying to the same firms. So hearing about people's different experiences and like getting hints and tips from other people as well is like super helpful when going through that.
Sure. And how do you balance the application process with things like lectures at uni, sports, if people are doing that, the social life? Is it something that is cyclical and there's a certain time of the year that you start applying, you do it consistently? Or did you find it worked best if you did it 1 week, heavy applications, 1 week off? What was your structure?
So I think different people have different approaches. I wouldn't say like this is necessarily the right approach, but I personally found it better to like do a mix, just because I enjoy taking a break. If I'm working on like just applications for like 1 week straight, I think I'd probably go a bit crazy. And then also you want to give yourself like time in between sort of each application to like reflect on what you could have done better. So spreading it out a little bit worked better for me. But like, just to be honest, you're just gonna have to like make some sacrifices sometimes. It can get a bit much, but like just trying to be as like super efficient with your time as possible helps. And like small things like if you can like listen to like FT news briefing on the way to like a lecture, right? If you do that for like a month coming up to your applications, you won't even have to research for like a trading, you know, interview. You'll have like so much material in the back of your head. So I think like there are like some small tips and tricks there.
Yeah, absolutely. And you touch on commercial awareness there, which I would argue is one of, if not the biggest factor in your favor going into an interview, if you can get that right. Being able to demonstrate not only your knowledge and understanding of financial markets, but actually your passion will feed through there, because like you say, you might be listening to the FT news briefing, could be reading Wall Street Journal, catching up with Bloomberg Live TV. All these things, tell me if I'm wrong, definitely feed into your application process. And also when you're sat down in an interview, do you find that by doing that, you can very easily articulate the latest news developments? And does that help with the whole interview process?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it almost doesn't even like matter, almost like in every finance role, they love to see that like commercial awareness. It's not just like trading or whatever, where they expect that. But like also you kind of learn that people can tell if you've just like crammed the FT the day before, because, you know, one news story will go really, really deep, but if you've really been keeping up with stuff, it'll connect to something that happened like a month ago, or you'll be able to offer like some other, you know, different insight and stuff. So I think like definitely don't like wait till like your interview to start like cramming FT. It can be like a little bit stressful. I've done it. If you can like spread it out and make sure that you're like constantly keeping up, it's also just kind of like more rewarding for yourself. Like you'll probably enjoy it more. Like when I like hear like a new news story and it like connects to something I read like a week ago, that personally makes it much more exciting for me as well. And that's something I'd recommend.
Sure, it's context, and it's also the story in a way that if you were to look at the energy prices and the cost of living crisis, although you could look at, say, an article published yesterday, commenting on the rising prices, having the whole backstory and following that from, say, closer to the start of the year gives you everything you need to actually say, well, yes, prices are up, but it's for these different reasons to different extents. And you can delve into any one of those given topics. So it's almost, rather than stating a news article you've read, you can have more of a conversation and debate about it. And I think that then feeds into the interview, and then they might have their own spin and they can actually quiz you on this topic that you brought up. But if anything, that would strengthen the whole chances of converting that interview into a successful offer.
Yeah, absolutely. And just like, also like sort of what's hot to talk about right now changes. So you can kind of see if you actually thoroughly understand the topic based on if all your talking points align with what's going on right now.
Yeah.
So for example, if like you want to talk about energy prices, obviously what's going on with like Russia and Ukraine right now is like super relevant. But if you can then talk about how, you know, we've underinvested in sort of like the oil industry over the past years, that's something which shows you're not just concerned about with what's going on right now. You also have like a deeper context to something, because that's something that was talked about a little while before, but it's kind of fallen to the back pedal now in light of like the more relevant news.
And then also the renewable energy infrastructure that we have. And although that's a fantastic and ideal solution, that we actually need time to get head to that net zero transition. And that although ideally we would have wind farms and hydrogen, blue hydrogen, that we need time to phase out the current things like natural resources and whatnot. And I think going to that level of detail must be super interesting, not just for the interviewer, but actually for yourself, and picking brains from someone who knows everything there is to know. And so commercial awareness was a very big and important point to sort of talk about as part of the application process. When it comes to the more nitty gritty of CVs and cover letters, those two, do you have any amazing tips or tricks that you've learned that are very easy to apply and that others can take away from?
So with like a CV, I think just find a good template. And like sense check that, like don't get it from one source, because you can kind of find like some wacky stuff online. But I think my university finance society had like a template and it was like super good. So I just took that, I did my own experience. I think in finance, they don't like want you to like go out of your way to do anything like super fancy or weird with your CV. So it's pretty much just about knowing what they want and tailoring it to that. In terms of like what you want to demonstrate with your CV, I'd say like draw out like the relevant skills. They literally tell you what they want from the role in like the application page. So demonstrate how you've, you know, demonstrated these skills. Especially in first year, I think it can be super hard to like do that, because you just started university. You've like probably not got much experience, and that's you know, on like a side note, that's like one other tip I'd say, you know, hit the ground running when you start first year, because applications open quickly, and if you've got nothing on your CV, it's harsh. But yeah, try and like tie in stuff that's not necessarily obvious. If you like played football when you was at sixth form and like your team won a cup or whatever, that can show like you've got like teamwork skills, you've got like leadership skills. These are all stuff people look out for, and like really draw that out and sort of be creative. And also people like interesting people. So, you know, it's good to have like experience and stuff like that and be able to demonstrate you've got passion for banking. But like if you've also got like other experiences that you can tie in well, that can work in your favor.
That's great advice, especially this idea that people aren't just looking for first year students to only be doing the application process. They want to see that you're involved in other societies, that maybe you have a leadership position as a president or vice president of a particular society. They want to see that you have outside interests, and actually you're not just one-dimensional focused on jobs and just the application process. And obviously that mixed with good grades and whatnot obviously helps a long way. But in that respect, finding a good template, structuring your CV, cover letters actually, do you find that it's important to tailor that as much as possible to each company? Did you find it fairly iterative, and how is your experience dealing with cover letters when applying to various jobs?
Yeah, so especially if you're applying to a lot of roles, you kind of have to strike the right balance. You can't send out generic cover letters because they'll just be put in the bin. If someone else has like tailored their cover letter, these institutions like really get to like pick the best. You're not gonna get an offer. But at the same time, you know, it's really timely to like make every single cover letter like super tailored. So there's like 3 sections you kind of want to include, like why you want to apply for the firm, why the division, and why they should pick you. So why they should pick you, there can be like a lot of overlap there, especially if you're applying for the same role. If I'm applying for like global markets, I like Goldman versus JP Morgan, that why you part is pretty much going to stay the same. And why the division, it's like pretty much the same division, so you can pretty much copy and paste that, maybe make like a slight change if like you want. Then why the firm bit is sort of like the paragraph that you're going to want to be tailoring every time. And if you can talk to anyone at the firm, if you can like look at news, what's going on at the moment, and sort of look at their website, sort of do like, you can do like 1 hour of research. It's like a lot. You can find out a lot in 1 hour. Or if you can like leverage your network or reach out to people on LinkedIn, that will like massively help. I would definitely recommend tailoring your cover letter.
Sure, I think the inside scoop goes a long way to be able to demonstrate that having spoken to people inside the company and your key takeaway was actually how great the culture was, speaking to someone who works there rather than just going on the website and seeing the various values of a company is incredibly helpful. And then going from the CV and cover letter as your first phase to things like the psychometric tests, virtual interviews, telephone interviews here, there's a marked step up, and actually it's a bit of a step change. So do you have any tips for how to prepare to these various stages of the application process?
Yeah, so I think psychometrics, you just kind of have to practice, especially like your first ones you might not do as well. I think like over time you get the hang of it, and like I don't really have like some insightful tip there. It's just like try and do as much practice as you can, whether that's through like hammering out applications from the start or like using online resources. So I think there's like different websites you can go to like practice the online tests. Personally, I didn't do that. I just sort of like did applications and got the hang of it later on. When it comes to virtual cover letters, I'd say like everything that applies to like an interview more broadly, but maybe like something specific to like the virtual ones. I think it can be quite hard to demonstrate your passion when you're talking to a laptop screen or like a webcam and you're not talking to a person. But looking back on how I started applications, I don't think I did a good job there. I think you need to think about how you're coming across and sort of, if you're like interested and passionate about what you're talking about, like let that show. Obviously it can like be quite nerve-wracking doing interviews and stuff, but I think like taking a relaxed approach and like allowing yourself to enjoy it, not sort of stressing it, can like, simple things like whether you're like smiling when you're talking about something, kind of like demonstrate your interest and passion, and that's something they really care about.
It's a fine balance with those video interviews, isn't it? Between being prepared and being rehearsed and being able to talk about something confidently with obviously a few cues here and there, but without it sounding too scripted. And it's the idea that, like you say, you want to treat it less like you're talking to a screen and more to a person, because naturally you'd have follow-ups if you were having a face-to-face interview. So iteration is really good takeaway from that. And then to talk on the final stages of that interview, and on your experience going into this internship, you mentioned that towards the start of the podcast, was that a face-to-face interview with one person that involved some sort of assessment center with various group activities? What did that look like for you?
So I've done quite a few assessment centers, but on the internship that I ended up accepting, there wasn't an assessment center. There was just like a bunch of different interviews. So I think I had a couple interviews where it was like 1-to-1, and then I had like later interviews where it was like 2 people questioning me. So I just, for the one I ended up accepting, it was just like a bunch of interviews back after back.
Understood. And how technical did that get? Was it a blend of things like your background, your previous experience, and then also commercial awareness plus the technical know-how? How did that look like?
Depends on like the assessment center and the role. Some of them were like slightly more technical, but even the most technical ones, really, like they'd ask technical questions, but I think they were more concerned with sort of how you responded to new information, how you learned, and like your thought process. So I remember on one of like my banking assessment centers, I didn't really know much about banking and how it worked. That was quite naive of me going into like an assessment center and not knowing a lot. But the interview would pretty much like feed me a lot of information, and then I was able to like respond quite quickly to that. And when they gave me their feedback, that's something they said. They said like, we appreciate you didn't have the knowledge, but we really enjoyed the fact that you were able to like take that in and like give a good response. So like what I'd say on that in terms of technical is like know what's expected of you. If you're like applying for like investment banking, you should like have like a rough idea of like how a DCF works and things like that. But at the same time, like don't stress over it. If you've come prepared and you've done the work, they won't expect you to know everything. I think having like a right attitude matters more, but definitely prepare.
No, that's fantastic advice. And it's probably broadly agreed that people interviewing you expect you to have a basic understanding of the world of finance. How does economics work, the financial statements, and like you touched upon, the basics of how do you value a company like a DCF. But they can teach you the real technical know-how. So it's having that interest and keenness to look at the resources, look at the various websites or blogs that teach you things here and there. And then, like you did in your interview, actually applying the questions that they ask and sort of spinning that and saying, well, look, here's my take on that, or here's what I know. And I think that's a similar format to actually some of the maybe Oxbridge interviews, where they'll ask you an impossible question and they just want to see how you think. Not that it's probably standard across investment banking interviews or others, but it's this idea that although you can prepare, you'll never be fully prepared and almost expect a very difficult question, but be calm, be confident, and actually if you don't know, then just don't say it.
Yeah, and like just on what you said, like being honest is like super important as well. Like when I was doing internship prep, I was talking to someone who is now doing global markets at Goldman Sachs, and I think on one of their interviews, they like messed up the relationship between like interest rate and bond yield. Like they couldn't tell the interviewer, and that seems like something that would screw up your interview, right? But like they were honest about not knowing it, and they like walked through with the interviewer, and the feedback they got as well is that because they were honest and they, you know, said they didn't know and were then able to like respond to new information, that's what they ultimately cared about.
That's exactly similar story, I should say, with a friend who was going to a top investment bank. I think it was in technology, and the interview went swimmingly, and it was an online virtual video interview, and they just got mixed up between buy side, sell side, and they came to me completely sort of disappointed, very upset that they think they'd completely messed up the interview based on one small hiccup. But really, it just goes to show that they did get the offer straight afterwards. So don't fret, don't panic if, you know, one question didn't go to plan. I think the interview isn't just about, did you tick all the boxes? Did you answer all the questions correctly? It's also, how did you handle it? How did you act? Did you come across as confident? Did you think rationally?
Yeah, I think like taking seconds to like remember that interviewers are like people as well helps, because, you know, imagine you're an interviewer, right, and you're interviewing a student, and this is someone that could potentially be working for you for the next couple of years. Are you really going to care about the fact that, you know, they messed up like one definition, or are you going to care about the fact that they're like hardworking and like a nice person and easy to get on with? So taking a second to think about that can like give you some insight into like what they'll probably care about.
Definitely. And again, these have been really invaluable insights to the application process that I'm sure our listeners can take away. And that feeds very well into the internship. And you've said that you've had a couple of experiences now. So it can be very daunting coming to the corporate world for the first time, especially from university where it's a completely different life altogether. So what are some tips if you're an incoming intern and it's your first week, you've never really been in an office environment, let's say, yet alone the financial industry, what are some things to help them prepare for that experience?
Yeah, so to be honest, I don't know how much preparation you can actually do, as much as it's about making sure you go in with the right mindset. Like before I started my internship, I kind of wanted to do that as well. I kind of wanted to like prepare and like know everything before you go in, but you can't really do that. I think probably before going in, have like some good commercial awareness so you can ask good questions, know what's going on with like the company and like the division, sort of what things are impacting them. But in terms of like going into like an office environment for the first time, if you've like had a job before, I don't think it's actually too much different. Just make sure you're like super nice to people and like you're asking good questions. I think asking questions is something that people don't do enough. When I've like talked to like other interns and stuff, a lot of their feedback that they got was that they didn't ask enough questions. And like remembering, you know, people don't expect anything of you. They just want you to be like curious and learn as much as possible. So I think asking good questions, you know, insightful questions, but at the same time, like don't like flood them with like useless questions that you could Google anyways, is like super important. And then having like the confidence sort of like speak up if you're in like a team session and you have a question or you have like an insight, say it. I think people like really respect that, or at least like my team really did, and it was a big part of my feedback. So I think having that mindset, just being confident and prepared before going in your internship is like the main thing. I think everything else you can kind of pick up.
Yeah, that's definitely an industry-wide aspect that interns, often the feedback is they don't ask enough questions or they didn't interact enough with colleagues at the various desks. that they've worked at. And actually asking questions, you said it perfectly. If you can Google it, maybe don't ask it. But equally, if you've got a question, a good question, ask it. And it's also judging the right time and place and knowing that if someone's busy or on a call, when to pull the trigger on asking that question. And that feeds into, in a way, being conscious of the office and office etiquette. When's a good time to approach people? What are busy times, when are not? And on office etiquette, did you find anything difficult to adjust to or easy to adjust to when you first joined on your first experience?
To be honest, not really, but that that might just be my arrogance. maybe like I did do a bunch of mistakes, but like no one told me, I didn't know about it. But I think just be respectful and nice. And I think like if you just have that mindset and you just genuinely do that, like you'll be fine. Trying to think if I like made any office etiquette mistakes. I think one time my manager was on a call, and I didn't realize he was on the call. And so I've like kind of called his name and he just looked over to me and I was like, oh, I didn't realize. And then I like sent him like an apology message afterwards or something. But yeah, I think to be honest, if you're just like respectful and like mindful the whole time, I think even if you make like small mistakes, like don't overthink it, just don't do it again.
Sure. And it is just treat it, like you say, don't overthink it. Don't get too stressed out. Just be well prepared, come well dressed, obviously, be polite, curious, respectful of people's times, their guidance. Would you say networking definitely helped during the internship to get a feel for the team, but then also the role and the culture of the place you worked at?
Yeah, I think like networking's super important. But I think something that like I hated when I started my internship is like how much people would use the word networking, but like never actually explained like what it was. Because it feels like kind of like a daunting word. It's like, oh, like, do I have to like send out like a formal email? Like, who do I know what to use? It's like, okay. But I think just, it goes back to what I talked about being curious before. Like, especially if you're working in a collaborative team, you'll have a conversation with someone and a topic will come up that's like relevant to a project that someone else is working on. And if you're just genuinely curious and you're respectful of their time and you shoot over a message and say, hey, I was talking about this, I looked into it, and it's a bit interesting. Can I have a conversation with you about it? I think that demonstrates your interest. You also get to like know all the different people on the team. At the end of the day, like it's like an extended interview. By the end of it, you want as many people to be able to vouch for you as possible. So if by the end you've had like one positive experience with like every person on your team, depending on how big the team is, I think that goes a long way. So making sure you interact with everyone is like super important, and being mindful of like the different roles that people have, like who's like the director on this team, who's like an associate or an analyst. I think just being mindful of the team can be super helpful.
Yeah, the hierarchy is definitely a factor which I think people coming in who aren't familiar with definitely need to bear in mind in terms of almost how you address people, especially Outlook and email etiquette is definitely a thing, and who you copy into emails and whatnot. And I really liked your take on the word itself of networking and how actually in some ways it's overused and overthought, and that if you treat people like in a normal conversation instead, and it's more natural and free-flowing than formally asking someone for a coffee chat and then very black and white asking them, look, how did you get to where you are today? What do I need to do? You want it, again, not to be forced. You want it to be relaxed. You want them to actually like you and get to know you. So although networking per se is important, treating it with whatever the word I'm looking for, without the stigma of networking is quite important. And actually, with your experience, you said that you really liked the team and you felt like you fit in. Is that a product of actually talking to everyone, whether it's people who work on the desk, people in different areas, and because you had that fit, you naturally learn more? Or did you have to make a conscious effort to sort of sit down with everyone individually and get to know them?
I think it's a bit of both. So I think I did get on like super well with the team, which like helped make it easier. But I did have like a list of everyone in the team that I wanted to talk to. So I had like a list in mind of, there's like 10 people I want to talk to over the next 3 weeks. I'm going to book in some time in my calendar. So you do have to be like somewhat conscious of it. Just keep in mind who you want to talk to. What do they do? What are their specialities? How can you facilitate that conversation? is there like a project you're working on that they may be like super relevant? Because I think time can flow by, and like if you haven't talked to enough people, that can like kind of stab you in the back. So I think taking like a conscious approach of it also helps.
So there's a clear structure there and systematic way that will actually help you to actually track and keep up to date with who you're talking to, who not. And do you find that that helps you in terms of the timing, and so that it doesn't get to the last week and you're doing a networking rush like probably others do?
Yeah, exactly. Because realistically, you'll have like half an hour in your diary free, or like you can stay like a little bit later and do that. It's like not that hard. It's just knowing to do that. So I think setting like goals of like how many people you want to talk to and by what time can help make sure you're on track. And if you have like a buddy or like a manager, they can help like a lot with that. So go out of your way to try and make sure you have a clear plan in terms of meeting the different people on the team.
Sure. And what are some tips you can give to people looking to convert their first internship? So what are the clear tick boxes that people have to be conscious of things to do right in order to have a greater chance of actually getting that full-time offer after the internship?
Yeah. So I think like the first thing is, remember, it's not just your projects. Everything you do is like part of the interview. And like when you get your feedback, you kind of like notice, oh, like they noticed that like really little small thing that I did, or like this small comment or like question or thing that like I volunteered for. So kind of when you're thinking about converting, try and make sure that you're always being conscious that you're being looked at, to avoid doing anything that might hinder your chances. But sort of making sure you're asking like insightful questions and being curious, something I talked about earlier, is probably like the most important thing. When you're working on projects, try and get it in before and get it done well. Kind of have to do both. If you're like leaving it to like the last minute, which is something I struggled with at times, and I had to like make sure I like picked that up throughout my internship, it doesn't like reflect good. So doing good quality work, doing it on time, go out of your way to like help people as well. If you see like a project that someone else is working on that they could use help with, or you could offer insight or like help them out of something small. I think a big part of my positive feedback was that I went out of my way to help a lot of the different team members. They'll give you work, but like always be conscious you can always do more. If you're like working on like a markets desk, for example, and you're like typing up like a summary of like the events that happened before and like sending that to your manager, is that something that like other people in the team could do? And something as small as like CCing them in that email, it's not much more work, but it's now like one person who you've added value to that will be able to vouch for you.
I see. So it's taking a thoughtful and mindful approach to the tasks you're doing, and not just sort of getting them done without any thought, but actually going, well, look, how can I add more value, or how can I help these people? And it's not quite as simple as someone gives you a task, you get it done by then, move on to the next task. And I like what you said in terms of treating the whole period of your internship as an interview, because in that way, you're always striving to be the best you can be, going above and beyond. And I think that word really does get used a lot because it is so important in the financial industry, especially as an intern. Realistically, as an intern, would you agree that because interns aren't the most proficient, they're quite new, or whatever their skill set, it's much more about enthusiasm and iteration and actually being proactive and helpful as you can, rather than it is about learning everything in a few weeks and actually being the best you can be at that job?
Yeah, like you're not going to come in and like reinvent everything, but you can save someone time. Like if someone's like a super busy person and you save them like half an hour of their day because you've gone out of your way to make like a small change that's made something more efficient, or do something that you know you can do for them, that's like massive, and like they'll almost care about that more because it has like a tangible impact on them. So just, I think, being conscious of the ways you can add value, things that seem small to you, make like a massive impression, and like be like quite ambitious in terms of what you want to get involved with. There may be like some tasks where you're thinking, oh, like I'm just an intern, I can't like add value here. But I think that like within any like big project, there are things you'd be able to help, whether that's like automating something or like changing an Excel sheet. And also, if you don't know, like sometimes it's still worth taking something on. I think Excel was something I wasn't like super proficient at during my internship. But like at one time, someone came up to me and said, "Hey, do you know how to do this in Excel?" And I was like, "No, I don't." And they was like, "Oh, I was kind of hoping you were like an Excel whiz kid. Never mind then." And then I was like, "No, hang on a second. Like this, like I'm not the best at Excel, but I think this might be a good opportunity for me to learn it." And then I like followed up with them, and I was like, "Yeah, I'm willing to like get involved with this." And then I ended up doing it, like helping them out with a project. I think that was like a good example of like having confidence in yourself that you would be able to like actually help people out.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's almost a Richard Branson approach of you might not know how to do it, but you'll learn. And I think my personal take on Excel, PowerPoint is they're really easy to learn. There's very minimal IQ needed to understand functions and shortcuts and actually even building models and whatnot. It's I think in general a bit overstated in terms of the technical proficiency needed, and it's very easy to learn. And like you said, just by taking on this project and having the attitude that you can learn and you will, there's so much in terms of online resources and people you can go to and your desk neighbors for support that I'm sure they'll appreciate more than anything you give it a try. And even if it's not up to scratch, they can fill in the blanks and actually teach you and give their feedback on it. And that's a better learning experience than saying outright no to something you might not feel comfortable about.
Yeah, exactly. I think it literally took me like 15 minutes to learn what I
Really?
needed to learn. And I think like Excel was one of the things that like looks so much complicated when you see people like hammering away at the keyboard and like everything's moving over the place and it looks more complicated than it actually is. So yeah, I definitely agree with that.
Good. No, that's really useful to know. And actually, coming away from your current internship, before we move on to things like working hours and whatnot, what were some of the more technical areas you picked up on during your specific recent experience?
My one would be quite unique because I was on the product team, and when you're launching a new fund, there can be a lot of operational considerations. So something I was looking at was how to hedge currencies in alternative investment funds, which it's kind of almost as complicated as it sounds, and I still haven't really wrapped my head around it, to be honest. But I think one thing that helped me get through that is like remembering that something that you don't know, there's always going to be someone that knows about it. There's like always an expert that you can reach out to. It's easy to try and like bury your head down and try and figure out everything yourself. But I think as long as you've, made the effort to do that, reaching out to people is like, okay, like people are like super willing to help out. Maybe don't go to like the same person like over and over again. You don't want to waste anyone's time. But sort of being in like a mindful, conscious way, reaching out to help is like, okay.
Yeah, it's being aware of who to go to help, when, at what time, and how frequently. It's this idea that if you're working next to your desk neighbor who happens to be your immediate senior, i.e. an analyst or an associate, they are more likely to be more approachable, more willing to help because they've been recently in your position. Whereas if it's your first iteration and you haven't even finished the draft, and you go to the managing director, you've probably not gone the most efficient way about it, right? Yeah. And I think that's where things like the hierarchy feed into it. So I think that's the right approach, and this idea that just give it a go, run with it, and then get feedback is really what a lot of, especially the more senior people in finance and in banking look for. It's people who have that almost startup entrepreneurial spirit of being able to run something they don't necessarily 100% know, teach themselves, do it to the best of their ability, and anything that's left over or that needs commenting on that can be done along the way. Yeah, and actually that brings me on to the working hours during your internship. So I think we hear a lot about all kinds of different working hours in different areas. In your experience, what was your average day-to-day? Was there an average day-to-day or did it change a lot?
So my day-to-day was actually like super chill compared to like some other areas in finance. I think asset management is generally much more relaxed than like banking. I think sort of like the people in the firm that were doing the longest hours were coming in at like 8 and then leaving at 7, which is like, that's like decent. And then maybe you do like some work on the weekends. I think I was told to come in at 8:30 and then leave at around 6. I'm kind of a morning person, so sometimes I'd get in at like 6:30, super early, and then like leave 6:30. So that was kind of my day, probably about like a 12-hour day or something. And then if I needed to get stuff done on the weekend, I just get it done.
Did you find that manageable? Did you think work-life balance actually was good enough for you to be able to do things outside of work and throughout the week being in London?
Yeah, I think like the work life was like really good, but I think the important thing for me is I don't mind working longer hours as long as there's a reason for me to be working longer hours and I feel like I'm actually doing work. I think you kind of hear that there's like stigma. Sometimes you feel like you need to stay in the office till midnight and you're not actually getting anything done. Like in my mind, there's like no point. If you're gonna like stay longer, make sure there's a reason to do that and there's actually output. Otherwise it looks like you're just staying longer for the sake of it and you're not actually getting work done.
Yeah, it's this idea that was coined on a YouTube video I must have seen quite recently that there's no such thing as work-life balance, but work-life choices. And with that comes sacrifices to a degree, but being able to work in a really great job that is stimulating, that you have a great team culture, and you do have time outside of work, on paper sounds like a fantastic balance, but really it's personal choice and this idea that on average, the financial industry does have longer hours. Having said that, it's very rewarding, it's fast-paced, there's a lot to learn, and there are still times for going on holiday, taking time at weekends to do. But you find that because you enjoy it so much that you don't even think about the working hours as a real consideration.
Yeah, exactly. If you're like enjoying what you're doing, I find it quite rewarding. Like if I like work harder and I see the output and I'm like proud of it, I'm like, this is good. I'm happy with this. At the same time, like sometimes there was not as much work to get done, and my manager would literally tell me like, it's 5, like you can just go home. So yeah, I kind of enjoyed the working culture there, where it was like people work hard and they deliver on their objectives, and if there's something that needs to get delivered, you knuckle down and you get it done. You stay longer, but at the same time, I wasn't expected to stay longer than I needed to just to show face.
That's great culture. And it is, especially now in this post-COVID era of when things like working from home now are becoming more and more important. This idea of when you're done working, you can switch off and you're not expected to be online or FaceTime in the office. And I think we'll continue to see that, hopefully more and more so, especially in the financial industry. And during the office, especially to aspiring interns who are currently at university or still at school listening to this, what advice would you give them in terms of you're in the office, you're working, say, 12 hours, 6:30 to 6:30 in the evening. Do you find that you're able to fit in some exercise during the day? Do you avoid going to places like prep for lunch or quick sandwich? Do you food prep? I mean, all these small things that don't usually get discussed in these kind of podcasts. Do you have any more generic lifestyle advice to people when you were doing your internships that might help them?
So this is like a little bit personal to me, but for me, something as small as like a 5-minute walk or like a 10-minute walk really helps. So throughout the day, I wouldn't necessarily take like an hour lunch. Sometimes I would, but sometimes I found it more helpful to sort of split that up into like smaller segments and do that throughout the day. Because if you're working on something and you're like staring at an Excel spreadsheet for like 5 hours in a row, sometimes just taking that like 5-minute break to like recharge your brain and relax can come back and make you much more efficient. There were times I was like struggling to figure something out, and then I'd just go outside and take a walk for like 5-10 minutes. I'd come back and I'd be like, oh, I've got it. So that really helps me.
And this idea that you don't have to be glued to your chair as an intern, and there isn't that expectation that you have to be in one place. And I agree that going out for fresh air, being outdoors, exercise, run, could probably go a long way. And then after work, did you have the opportunity to go out for a drink with your fellow interns or do some group activities together at any stage during the internship?
Yeah, so I like hanged out with the team. Maybe like on like Thursday would be like the day, go outside for drinks, and I think that was like super helpful just in like getting to know your team outside of the office. I think like having good working relationships is like super important, but in the office it can be quite limiting in terms of how you can develop that. So I think taking that like 20 minutes, you know, even if you don't want to like stay long, it's like fine, but just taking that like small time out after work to like have a quick conversation with some of your team and like get them on like a more personal basis kind of like goes a long way in terms of like developing that relationship, and also make work more fun for you, because when you can come into the morning and like ask your colleague, oh, like, how's your dog doing now? You know, it just makes the work day more enjoyable.
More personable, and it's just as important to get on well with your colleagues outside of the office than it is inside. And actually, I think Jeff Bezos coined it quite interestingly that although thinking work-life balance is like this 2D seesaw, actually if you think of it as a circle, that actually if you're happy at work, you come back into your life happy, and then that trickles down and it flows. Equally, if you're in a bad mood, that affects everything. By actually making a conscious effort to get on well and enjoy spending time with your colleagues, that will most certainly trickle back to how you feel when you get back home, if you feel more inclined to check your emails in the evening or not. So I completely agree with that. And that reflects really well, I think, on whichever internship people are working on, if they feel like they can go out and feel comfortable around their team and whatnot. And speaking to your fellow, say, interns and people in your finance society, do you feel like they've all had that same positive experience as you have? Or do you see some who are going through maybe a bit of a tougher time or still trying to figure things out? What's the average sort of second to third year students' experience with internships?
So obviously there's like a mix. There's some people like enjoying it, some people aren't enjoying it as much, but I definitely say like the average is really positive. I think like for the most part, it'll like you can expect like a really positive experience. If you like have the right mindset, like you'll have difficulties, it'll be like challenging sometimes, but if you like make the effort to like get on with the people around you and you know make the effort to like try hard at work, I think for the most part you can expect like a really positive and fun experience. Even like besides the career progression and like just doing the internship for the sake of it, I think like I'm happy I spent my 8 weeks there, genuinely just for like the fun of it. I think like I learned a lot, met some cool people, I really enjoyed it. So, and I think that's most people's experience. So I think don't like feel daunting about it. It'll probably be good.
Understood. And as we wrap up, do you have any final points of advice, of wisdom you'd like to share with prospective interns, people going through the application process? What would be like, let's say, your top few tips?
I'd say my top tip would be, especially for like people coming into university now, just be aware of like the resources that are out there. So like, for example, Financial Edge Training offers like training courses, stuff like that. SEO London is like an organization that helps like students break into background from like disadvantaged backgrounds. They work a lot of like gender diversity, that sort of thing. Upreach is another shout out. Rare Recruitment. There's like a lot of organizations out there that provide the resources online to help develop your network and like your skills and knowledge, and also provide opportunities. So I think just sort of have like a quick search around. There's like a lot of help out there.
Yeah, and it could be as simple as also tapping into the alumni database for your current college or school, or even tapping into, say, the finance or economics department's budget or network and saying, hey, are you guys able to fund a networking event that we have in mind? So like you said, there's all sorts of options available. But yeah, there's been some fantastic advice. It's so great to hear about your journey. We're really excited to see how you progress over the coming years, and all the best going forward. But Ahmed, look, thank you so much for coming on board, and it's been a real pleasure talking to you today. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, then hit the follow and subscribe button to keep up to date with our latest episodes. For more content and resources, check out Financial Edge Training's website and social accounts. Financial Edge is trusted to train new hires at top investment banks. Our courses, resources, and tools will help you to succeed in finance.